How's it going, everybody? Welcome to Tombstone's Takes. I am Tombstone, and I love to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and interesting about books. Now, recently, I read Carrie, the first novel by Stephen King, and I had some thoughts about it. So, as one does, I wrote an essay about it. Please stick around and enjoy this essay I entitled Stephen King's Carrie and the Possibility of Violence. Thanks for watching. By the time I reached the 6th grade, Stephen King had breached the social consciousness numerous times, not only with his books, but in the cinema as well. I distinctly remember sitting in my English class at 11 years old, discussing Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, when another student asked our teacher about Stephen King. He specifically asked whether or not he thought that one day Stephen King would be studied in English the way we were studying Edgar Allan Poe. The connection the student made between the two authors was both the authors were scary. Listening to that discussion, I could only picture the recent movie trailer for Stephen King's Maximum Overdrive and think, that's not scary, that's ridiculous. Now the movie Halloween, that's scary. And yes, Michael Myers with his sheer white mask, the long pointed knife hidden among a dark jumpsuit. Yes, that was scary. But why? Was it the movie poster that sported a picture of a jack-o'-lantern in shadows? Or was it John Carpenter's driving music? Or Michael Myers himself? It was all of the above, and it was all of those things because they hinted at possibilities, especially the possibility of violence. What do I mean by the possibility of violence? I mean the stir your heart, get your blood pumping, scream as loud as you can in order to warn others, feeling that you get because you feel you're in mortal danger. It's the idea that harm can befall you and your loved ones that keeps you up at night, afraid to go to sleep. Does Maximum Overdrive have that quality? Was it scary? No, those cars were just silly. And somewhere in the back of my mind, King could never write anything scary. It might be safe to say 11-year-olds don't know much about writing, but they do know about scary. Well, they know what they find scary. And the things that scared me, in my mind, all maintain the possibility of violence. Michael Myers, masked up and wielding a knife, hinted at the possibility. But even more so, Edgar Allan's Telltale Heart, The Pit and the Pendulum, and the Cask of Amontillado, not only hinted at the possibility of violence, but followed through on the act in terribly gorgeous ways to read. Over the years, because of the one lesson in that random English class, I maintained that Poe was gloriously beautiful and scary, and King ridiculous. I tried King a number of times with various hits and misses. When reading the man's work, his prose felt chunky to me, like chewing on rocks instead of food. At times, his narratives were implausible, illogical, inconvenient, with characters and dialogue inserted only to serve the overall plot of the story, rather than allowing the characters' agency and decisions to come to their natural consequences. There have been other times when I've found his books quite fun and engaging, if not fantastic in depth, breadth, and scope. I mean, there's got to be some gems in all that work he produces, right? And I did happen to find one or two. But nevertheless, I know that the man has the terrible bad habit of telling the reader what will happen before it happens, as if that's the hook he wants to use to build suspense. Spoiler alert, it's not. I also think he struggles to create an atmospheric setting that lends itself to a chilling story, an aspect of Gothic and horror tales that I find is essential to success. Well, at this point, you may wonder if I think King has any talent at all. And yes, I found that there are some things that King is quite talented at. In fact, he excels at some things. He excels at creating characters who commit real-life terror. I rarely find the possibility of violence in his supernatural characters, his monsters or pulp creations. No, it's in the everyday characters King excels at revealing horror. The overly religious, fundamentalist, crazy Christians like Margaret White, who locks her daughter, Carrie, in a closet for 6 hours at a time. Now that is scary. Or Jack Torrance, alcoholic and a man who breaks his toddler's arm. Now he's scary. These kinds of characters is what King excels at creating in his narratives, not some haunted hotel that keeps me frightened at the possibility of harm if I enter the building. No, he creates real violence in real people, and I find that aspect of his books terrifying, even if I might not feel that his narratives are entirely stellar. So now, years later, and no longer 11 years old, I decided to read King's first novel, and I'm here to expound a few thoughts on the matter. Now that I'm no longer 11 years old, did I find that he wrote something scary? Did I like it? Or am I the same as that little 11-year-old who found the Maximum Overdrive trailer bumbling and ridiculous? And do I automatically assume all of King's tales will lead to laughter rather than sheer fright? I already said, I have found some gems in his work. Having just finished my read of Carrie, I can definitely say this. Many of those and most of those criticisms that I mentioned from King remain. His prose is chunky and annoying. His habit of telling you what will happen before it happens in every book reeks of amateurish storytelling, and his plots at times are implausible and illogical. On this read of Carrie, though, I was pleased to find a tale that was more plausible and more logical than others. There wasn't much for me to worry about in terms of conveniently placed characters who only existed to advance on a plot point or to pontificate at the audience. I was also pleased to see how King used the epistolary format in order to create an overall unreliable narrator in the text. He used various citations from fictional works he created, and all those works contradicted each other and added a feeling of ambiguity that works so well in many horror stories. And though I can't say that I was terribly scared on reading Carrie, I can say that I can see why so many people find this book chilling. You see, as I grew older from that 11-year-old who was afraid at the possibility of violence, I learned not to be scared until I have to be. But other people still cling to their same childhood kinds of fears and grow up with them, and some of those fears never lead. And King, in his novel Carrie, builds up the possibility of violence very well. The story centers around a girl with telekinetic capabilities, powers she uses as a defense mechanism to keep from being harmed. And after being bullied her entire life, in the throes of anger at being the butt of yet one other joke, she destroys an entire town. I think it's unfortunate King develops more of Sue Snell and Chris Hargison and Billy Nolan than he does of Carrie. Having her say, "Oh yeah," so many times reeks of laziness in the text, and it adds little to the feeling the author knows what he's doing, or giving us a well-rounded character in Carrie. Yet that's not really the issue I want to talk about. I said that King builds up the possibility of violence in Carrie, and he does it in an excellent manner. He commits to it in that we see an entire town destroyed, but that's not the fear or the possibility of violence he's truly going for. That's the setup. The fear is in the possibility that the violence will occur again. He specifically tells us about the telekinetic gene and how there's the possibility of it being passed on from female to female in a family. He leaves us with more freaks out there with power. And what will they do? He specifically gives us reports of the scientists who want to know about the gene, but also reports from the politicians who not only want to scapegoat for the destruction of an entire town, but to keep those people in fear of it happening again. In many ways, this story follows the same human patterns and arguments for and against gun control. A tragedy happens, and now the argument is, what next? How do we keep this from happening again? Should telekinesis be extinguished because telekinetics wield the power to destroy a town? That's the implicit question in the text. And King's already shown us the tragedy, the school shooting, if you will. He's also shown us the bullying and the hurt that leads to those tragedies. And he leaves you hanging with the ambiguity, knowing that the telekinetic gene is still out there. And what should people do in order for that tragedy to never happen again? There are tons of questions in the book, especially now that we're talking about the possibility of experimenting on humans or banning humans just because they could be seen as weapons. Should people be allowed to live if they have telekinesis? Should they be experimented on? What happens if someone causes another tragedy? Oh my gosh, We need to stop all of these tragedies from occurring, and how do we do this? And can we do it without being monsters ourselves? If this happens again, I don't know what we'll do. These questions are scary. Yes, despite the chunkiness of the prose and the often implausible plot lines Stephen King creates, in Carrie, I did find the real-life terror and bullying and crazy loons who use religion as an excuse for their crazy to be terrifying. But I also found the possibility of violence in the telekinetic gene. And what would happen if a new Carrie White descended on a different town and destroyed it? Yes, like so many school shootings, a town being destroyed by a telekinetic person leaves us with a chill. And I found it there in the novel. And though I wasn't really scared, I did find the book enjoyable, if not great. And mostly, I can know and understand why so much of this book has entered into the social consciousness, not only through the book, but the movie adaptations as well. Because this possibility of violence is true and real for so many people. And sometimes we just really like being scared.